You're listening to the podcast Discarded, a true crime show that covers unsolved cases and works with real families to search for real answers. With your host, Lynn Marie.
Welcome back for episode 3 of Discarded. We're going to continue discussing the case of missing person Jennifer Poole. I wanted to apologize for the delay in the release of this episode. I had an entire hour planned out to discuss Gilgo and the Long Island serial killer, but I had to go back and re-record most of the episode, and I'll explain why. After episode 2 aired, I received several tips from listeners, which I was actually surprised after only 2 episodes that we were gaining such attention, especially after the poor audio quality of episode 1. But I received calls from a few listeners who were not directly acquainted with those involved, but had heard from a friend of a friend of a friend, some rumors, etc. And they've provided me with names of individuals who may have information regarding this case. So I started reaching out to these individuals, and as you can imagine, even with the magic of skip tracing, Google, social media, it's been challenging locating some of these individuals, and while I was successful in finding many of them, some just weren't willing to talk. But for privacy reasons, I am going to leave some of the names and specifics out for now. In the last episode, we talked about Ernest Mateen as a potential suspect, but we also talked about Gilgo Beach. Why did I think these cases could potentially be connected? Well, where Jenny resided in Bayshore, it was a short distance from Gilgo. If you consider the span of beach where the bodies were found, she was approximately 10 to 15 miles from any one of those sites and just a few minutes away by boat. Now, Jenny's body was never recovered, but there were also other cases that were potentially linked to the Long Island serial killer whose bodies were not recovered at Gilgo. I'm not an expert on these cases, so I started reaching out to others who've already done a deep dive on Gilgo, and then a news flash comes across my phone. The police are going to hold a news conference with new evidence on Gilgo. On Thursday, the police held a news conference. They provided previously undisclosed evidence in the Gilgo Beach murders in an effort to seek out help from the public and shed light on the investigation. They also announced a new website, gilgonews.com, dedicated exclusively to the Gilgo Beach investigation to better facilitate information exchange with the public, where they'll release information and the public can also provide tips through this website in addition to Crime Stoppers. The evidence released to the public was a cropped photo of a black leather belt with embossed letters HM or WH. They've had this since the initial stages of the investigation and believe this was handled by the suspect. Also, they advised they were granted approval by New York State Department of Health and provided the FBI with DNA samples from the unidentified victims for the purpose of conducting genealogy testing. This would assist in potentially identifying relatives of these victims. I can't even express to you how elated I was to see that their continued efforts are still going into this case. I viewed the website, and along with the other resources, I started breaking down each case one by one, trying to tie what I think could be similarities between these victims and what I know of Jenny at this point. Now, the similarities that I knew were 1, the proximity to the victims, 2, some of the victims were addicts, and 3, solicitation. I wasn't clear on this earlier. Prior to meeting the older gentleman who had provided for Jenny financially, there were times that she did escort. So I broke down these cases one by one, and I scripted out hours worth of discussion. In mid-recording, I get a call. I receive a call from someone who does not wish to be identified, but gave me some very useful information. So while I was focused on Gilgo, I quickly deterred from that theory and refocused back on Ernest Mateen and others. In the last episode, there were several questions about Ernest Mateen. How was Jenny introduced to him? What was their relationship? Why was he suspect number 1? And why were they searching for her in the canal? This caller was able to answer many of these questions. Again, I don't want to state his relationship to anyone involved in an effort to protect his identity, but he did know most of the parties involved, and while unsure of the specific relationship that Ernest had with Jenny, Jenny knew him through someone who was close to her. That someone also knew the man that was footing the bills for Jenny. Ernest was supposedly a drug dealer, or he had people running drugs for him. And like everyone else, Ernest saw dollar signs in this guy who was essentially Jenny's sugar daddy. So the rumor mentioned earlier that Ernest was extorting money from him appears to be true. And not just extorting money from him, he was driving around in this guy's vehicle. I believe it was a Hummer, but he was driving around in this car as if it was his own. And after talking to this guy and Christine Moore, the impression I have of the older gentleman who was taking care of Jenny financially, he was a kind, harmless man who happened to be a doormat. Since the last episode, Christine was able to provide me with old messages that she actually found from this older gentleman. After Jenny went missing, they actually had some sort of, relationship, friendship, working together to try and get justice for Jenny. And I'm not going to read the emails verbatim because they are personal emails, but it appears that this gentleman actually had a genuine friendship with Jenny. He also did talk about the extortion in these emails, so these rumors are no longer rumors. So it appears that somehow Jenny was getting in the middle of this and was going to do something to compromise Ernest's newfound windfall. So allegedly, around the time that Jenny went missing, Ernest was at the older gentleman's house, also in the company of others, and was incredibly angry that Jenny had the vehicle that Ernest had stolen fair and square from this guy. So he was looking for the car, went to this older gentleman's house to see if it was there, realized it wasn't there, and became enraged. At that time, Ernest made the statement, something to the effect that, "I'm going to kill that bitch. There are 2 people going into the water and only one is coming out." So Ernest left the house with another person to go get the vehicle. Well, this answers our question as to why Ernest was suspect number 1 and why they were searching for Jenny in the canal. These statements were obviously given to the police prior. So the assumption here is, given the blood in the apartment, that Jenny was either killed in the apartment and her body dumped in the water, or there was at least an altercation in the apartment and then she's killed elsewhere. I know I refer to this case as a missing persons, but that's only because the body has never been recovered. This person also told me that there is a 99% chance that someone else witnessed this or helped Ernest dispose of the body. So what do we know so far? On April 28th, Jenny was last seen in front of her family's house. On April 28th, the same day, Joey also went to Jenny's apartment and she told him, "Get out of here, he's coming." Joey also mentioned that there weren't any cars in the driveway, so Jenny did not have the Hummer at that time. She was in the Hummer earlier on that day with Ernest. So when did this incident happen with Jenny that she took the vehicle and then Champ and this other person went to get it back? Well, we know Joey went to the apartment 2 days later and Jenny was not there. And we know the landlord went to Christine's job on May 3rd saying he hadn't seen Jenny in some time. Now, the missing persons flyer made by the police state that April 29th was the last time Jenny was seen. Not sure if this is a misprint or if they have a witness who saw Jenny after the family did. Again, I know I say that the police aren't giving us any information, but I don't mean that the police are not cooperating. They're doing their job. As in any open investigation, they shouldn't disclose any information that could potentially compromise the investigation. So that said, I take the same stance and in my position think it would not be responsible to publish anything that could in fact compromise exactly what we're trying to accomplish, which leads me to say that this caller also gave me additional details that I am not ready to publish. I do not believe some of the information was included in the initial investigation. I could be wrong, but I am fairly certain that some of this information is new. This information, I believe, helps button up the timeline and makes April 28th the date that she went missing. I believe that the incident with the car happened on April 28th, and that Jenny was in the Hummer that day with Ernest in front of her sister's house because that was the day that Ernest went with that other individual to get the car back from Jenny. I do not believe that those 2 black eyes were from a picture that fell off of the wall. I believe that Jenny went to Christine's house that day to see her mother because she knew that something bad was going to happen to her. I believe we know what happened to Jenny. I believe that Jenny was killed by Ernest Mateen, but I believe that Ernest did not act alone in this, and I do believe that we know who else was involved. I do believe that there are other individuals outside of the suspected associates who know as well. What we do not know is specifically where Jenny's body was disposed of. I do know that there were means to dispose of her body that were probably overlooked by law enforcement at that time because they didn't have some of this information. Who were the suspects, though, at the time? You had Ernest, who was questioned, and then he took off once the case went to homicide. An arrest warrant was never issued. The landlord was questioned, but he voluntarily took a polygraph and was cleared. The older gentleman was questioned, but after understanding his profile, he's a harmless man who was just being taken advantage of. Joey was questioned and even saw Jenny the same night that she went missing, but the police cleared him as well. So this new information that I have, that I'm not comfortable disclosing at this time, may answer some questions, but would it lead to a conviction at this point? Probably not. Will it answer exactly where Jenny's body is resting? Maybe. But I do believe that there are other pieces of evidence that are already with the police that could have been overlooked. While I was researching the Gilgo cases, I was looking for connections, and soliciting was one of them. Most of these girls solicited on Craigslist, so asked Chris if anything was found on Jenny's laptop. So going back to the day Christine first made the report after she found Jenny's apartment a bloody mess, she said that when the police came to the house, they asked them to leave the apartment. And while she was leaving the apartment, there was a packed black bag by the front door. When Christine returned to gather Jenny's items, it was gone. So, along with Jenny's laptop, those two items, and there were probably more, but those were the most noticeable items that Christine noticed were missing. Now, Christine is not sure why the bag was gone, but the police said they didn't see a bag. But who knows, maybe they took it for evidence and didn't say why. But the police did tell her that they did not have the laptop. Miraculously, the laptop shows up a few weeks later. Now, maybe it was in an area of the house where Christine just missed it, or maybe someone held on to it and intentionally cleaned the laptop before turning it into the police. As mentioned in episode 1, Christine said that her mom bought this laptop for Jenny to go to school when she was going for medical coding. And then in episode 2, Joey mentions the laptop as well and said Jenny does everything on her laptop. He also told me that she writes everything down. She basically journals her life. But there has never been confirmation if the laptop was examined. If someone did try to wipe the laptop, maybe they did not find anything, but depending on the method of deletion, maybe the laptop can tell us something more that we're missing here in this story that would indicate where Jenny could be. And also talking with Christine Moore, she is convinced that the bag in the apartment, along with the other items went missing during the investigation, were not taken by the police. So if this is true, then someone was cleaning the crime scene and disposing of evidence. So, after all of these pieces in this convoluted puzzle are put together, yes, there are still missing pieces. However, we do have the gist. We think we know what happened to Jenny. We think that she was violently killed by Ernest Mateen with either assistance or a witness. We think we know why something happened to Jenny. We think that she was getting in the middle of some financial deal between this older gentleman and Ernest, but we do not know where she is. But we know that somebody does know. There are so many people not willing to talk, and that says a lot. I've reached out by phone to some, email to some, social media to some, and the response has been not really consistent, fragmented, but very similar responses. One person I reached out to by